The hospital teaches you to speak quietly, even inside your own head. Under the fluorescence, voices sound too sharp. Under anesthesia, secrets sound too soft. I keep my voice low for nights like this, when a surgical assistant brought me a story that still feels sterile cold to the touch. She was new to our service then, 2 years in, steady hands, no flair for drama, Mara. The kind of tech who preps her mayo, stand like a prayer, each clamp angled, each suture thrown to the same compass point, every count said twice in a voice that wouldn't wake a baby. The case was supposed to be simple. An ER transfer with a hot belly, likely a perforated appendix, the kind of emergency room horror that turns into routine once you've scrubbed to the elbows and draped out the world. Night shift, of course. Things that come in at midnight always take more than they need. She told me she felt it first in the air, like the room had been sealed not just against germs but against time. The vents hummed, the monitors breathed their out-of-sync lullaby, and the fluorescence did that tremor you catch at the edge of your vision. Nothing to chart, nothing to say out loud, just that thin hospital feeling, a liminal pause before whatever is about to matter. They'd converted from laparoscopic to open when the omentum looked angry and the appendix hid like something ashamed. The surgeon asked for the retractor, and Mara placed it into his waiting hand the way she always did. Handle first, eyes on field, mind already walking 3 steps ahead. He needed more exposure. She helped lift what he couldn't see around. Clamp. Suction. Irrigate. The cadence of the operating room can be a kind of prayer, too. The body opens like a sentence. The instruments make grammar out of blood. Halfway through, the count started to itch in her head. It wasn't wrong. Not yet. But wrongness had a shape she knew by the way her fingers hesitated when they came back from the field. Sponges. 5 and 5. Needles. Matched to the packet. Metal sings a certain note when it returns home to the tray. Tonight, something answered an echo she hadn't made. Pause, she whispered to the circulating nurse during a lull, not loud enough to cross the sterile field, just enough to be heard by the person whose job was to hear. The nurse nodded. Eyes on the whiteboard where the counts live, that little rectangle of certainty in a world that forgives so little. Confirmed. Still good. The surgeon didn't look up. His focus was somewhere between the elevator of the scalpel and the ceiling, where the lights floated like glass moons. The first anomaly was small. A Kelly clamp resting on the corner of the drape, misaligned by a hair. Mara didn't remember setting it there. No one had called for it. A thing like that could be storyless. Could be nothing. She adjusted it back to the tray and felt the way its teeth bit gently at stainless steel. Habit? Control returned to her bones. She breathed the smell of sterile saline and warmed cautery, chemical bread and metal rain. The second anomaly arrived with intention. She reached for a Richardson retractor, eyes never leaving the field, and her hand met metal before it should have. The Richardson was already there in the angle of shadow to her left, laid out parallel to the one on the Mayo stand. Same size, same weight when she shifted it. But no one had opened a second pack. She glanced at the wrapper bin. Empty, the paper sleeves folded tight like sleeping birds. She scanned the stamps on the handles, those tiny serial numbers we pretend not to memorize. The 2 retractors wore the same hospital mark, the same dot of paint at the neck. The second one had a serial she knew had been retired the winter before, when a senior tech named Evelyn left, and never came back after a stroke on her day off. Maura had trained under her. Evelyn had loved her retractors like people. There are moments you keep inside the sterile field because to say them is to break the ritual. Mara didn't speak. She simply used the retractor the surgeon asked for and set the other aside, not rejecting it so much as allowing it to cool in the corner, like a word you don't know how to pronounce in front of company. Clamp, the surgeon said, eyes still in the wound. Mara placed a Kelly in his palm. The monitors beeped in a rhythm that felt a half beat off, as if the OR were listening to a different song in the adjacent room. The circulator moved behind them, charting, whispering the time of each suture, the irrigation volume, the sponge updates that anchor the body back to math. The field flooded once, briefly, Unexpected venous ooze from a surprised little branch. Nothing dramatic. Suction answered. Then silence. Then the soft return of red into the canister like a tide with manners. If you were telling this as one of those hospital horror stories meant to spook the easy, you'd say the room grew colder. She didn't. She said it differently. The vent hum didn't travel. It landed. They found the appendix at last, sullen and sly, hiding behind its own curtain of angry fat. It came out with a sigh. Or perhaps that was the anesthetized breath above the drape. Closure began. Sponges accounted for. Needles matched and double-checked. Mara did her mental chant and then did it again with her mouth, counting because that is what saves us from the worst kinds of headlines. All good. Until the extra. Final count. The circulator said, pen ready, voice going, that careful patient calm we reserve for the moment before we reopen a wound and a case turns to ash. We have one extra Kelly clamp. No one wants an extra anything. It means a story isn't behaving. It means something is here that shouldn't be here because no one invited it. The surgeon kept his tone even. Confirm. The anesthesiologist didn't look away from the vitals. The heartbeat on the monitor found the correct rhythm at last, as if the machine had been cleared of a small grief. Mara laid out the instruments, one by one, two by two. The way children teach themselves order when the adults at home are tired. The Kelly should have matched. They did not. One bore the current series of numbers. The other carried a serial with a bend in the middle, where old stamping had left a scar. She knew it. Not because she was superstitious, she told me. Because she is meticulous. Because she remembered which set Evelyn favored when the retractors had to sing through a long night of unplanned work. We didn't open this, the circulator said softly. Then it walked in. The scrub tech at the back murmured, not unkindly, just the gallows humor of people who need a pressure valve. Mara did not laugh. She studied the floor, the tray, the sterile field, looking for the switching place. The moment one thing divided and became two without permission. They finished the closure. The extra clamp went into the red bin for decontamination. Because if something appears, you treat it like it belongs until proven otherwise. The circulator filed the anomaly. She also filed the serial number note, because paperwork is the only exorcism the hospital believes in. The patient went to recovery without complaint. Vital signs. Good. A normal conclusion pinned like a butterfly that never quite stops moving. Later, in decontam, Mara rinsed off a retractor, and the water ran warm over her gloves. She said the room smelled like damp heat and old promises. She set the instrument into the tray and felt the empty weight next to it, where the extra Kelly had lain a moment before. Not gone, but no longer declaring itself. She could have left it there. She should have. But her feet took her, still in scrubs, hairnet mark across her forehead, to Central Sterile, where the log of retired equipment lives on a wall that no one visits unless they have to. The logs are not haunted. They are bureaucratic. That is their mercy. She traced the columns with a gloved finger and found the serial. Retired last winter. Owner of record, Evelyn H. Notes. Damaged hinge. Sentimental value. Do not recirculate. She took her finger off the paper and let her hand fall to her side. It's not that she thought Evelyn had come to help. It's that the room felt, briefly, like two rooms stacked, and in one of them the extra clamp belonged to a tray that hadn't existed since a woman with patient hands taught a younger one how to set a mayo stand, like a prayer. I kept quiet, Mara said. I kept it in the paperwork lanes where the world is rational. She did not cry when she told me this. She is not that kind of confessional. But she looked at the ceiling and her silence pressed a shape into the air. There was an aftermath you could file. The recovery went fine. The labs normalized. The patient went home complaining only of the itch that closures bring. There was an aftermath you could not file. A week later, on ICU night shift, Mara walked a tray past the glass and saw in the reflection a mayo stand already dressed for a case that wasn't scheduled yet. Retractors laid in Evelyn's old order, sutures curled like little crescents facing an old north. She turned. The room behind the glass was dark. She turned back. In the glass, the tray waited, as if expecting someone to finish the count. She blinked, and the reflection remembered itself. People ask me why I listen to these accounts, why I keep them, why I let them settle into the marrow of the hospital I carry around. It's not because I love the paranormal, or because I want to believe in ghosts. It's because some unexplained hospital cases don't want belief. They want attention. They want you to say out loud that order sometimes breaks in ways that leave no blood on the floor, only a record that refuses to match. The extra instruments. The chart that changes after you sign it. The monitor that sings the wrong song until the moment a name is spoken under breath. If you need me to make it smaller, I can. I can tell you it was a logging error, a misscan, a slip of the eye. I can tell you no one died because of it, that this isn't a cautionary tale, but a true story tucked into the pile. One of those hospital horror stories that lives between the lines of the EMR and the low thrum of the vents, unremarkable to the uninitiated. I can say all that and still tell you this. When Mara sets her tray now, she leaves a space the width of a Kelly clamp where nothing should go. Not out of fear, out of respect. Out of the knowledge that some absences need a place to stand, so they don't have to take one. The next hallway felt colder, and somewhere down it, another assistant was washing her hands longer than the policy requires. The operating room doesn't forget easily. The walls don't gossip like nurses, and the instruments don't whisper like patients, but the air remembers. Mara carried that memory into the following week. Her steps softer, her counts sharper, her silence more deliberate. She didn't speak about the extra Kelly to anyone but the circulator, and even then, only through the formal language of paperwork. But silence inside a hospital isn't stillness, it's pressure. She was on another night rotation when it pressed hardest. Emergency case. This time, a young man who'd collapsed on the basketball court. Blunt abdominal trauma. Suspected internal bleeding. The ambulance had rushed him through the ER, and by the time Mara scrubbed in, the surgical team already buzzed with the peculiar tension that comes when time is being measured against liters of blood. She prepped her Mayo stand as always. Clamps aligned in military rows, sutures spiraled like coiled snakes, retractors gleaming under the overhead light. Her hands worked in ritual, her mind worked in memory. Each placement was a ward against what had happened before. And still, the unease returned. It wasn't the patient, though his color told the room more than the monitor did. It wasn't the surgeon, though his clipped requests carried the edge of urgency. It was the room itself. The vents didn't hum evenly. One of the overhead bulbs flickered in a rhythm that seemed personal, as if it knew Mara was watching. When she looked down, she saw her clamps resting perfectly in line, except one. A Kelly tilted slightly toward her, as if waiting to be picked up. Her stomach pulled tight. She told herself it was fatigue, nothing more. But when she lifted the clamp, its weight was subtly different. Not enough to measure, just enough to feel. She checked the handle. The serial number was worn, almost smoothed away, as though it had seen years more service than the rest. Retractor, the surgeon said, pulling her back into the living moment. She delivered the instrument. Suction, irrigation, clamp. Her body moved like it always did, muscle memory dictating the ballet of hands, metal, and silence. But her eyes kept sliding back to that tray, to the Kelly resting where it shouldn't. And then came the sound, not loud, not external. A metallic tap, sharp and deliberate, echoing inside her ear, as if someone had rapped the clamp against stainless steel just beside her. She glanced at the circulator, but she hadn't moved. The anesthesiologist was focused on vitals. The surgeon was buried in the wound. No one else had heard. Her breath caught. For a moment, she was certain she would speak, say something, break the rhythm, confess the absurd. But the words froze. Because if she said it out loud, the room would change. The atmosphere would split into believers and skeptics, into ridicule and unease. Better to hold it. Better to let it rot in silence. The bleeding vessel was found, clamped, tied. The patient's blood pressure crawled back toward safety. Relief swept the team like a cool wind through sweat. Closure began. But as Mara passed the final suture, she saw it. On her Mayo stand, laid out as if prepared by another hand, was not one extra instrument but three. A Kelly. A retractor. A pair of scissors with a handle style, discontinued 5 years prior. None of them had been opened tonight. None of them belonged here. The count came. Sponges. Correct. Needles. Correct. Instruments. Too many. Again. The circulator's face drained of color. "We've got extras," she whispered. The surgeon, already stripping gloves, froze. "Extras," he repeated, the word carrying both disbelief and accusation. Mara said nothing. She simply laid them out, handles aligned. Her fingers shook for the first time since she'd learned this craft. And here is the thing no one writes in the charts. The surgeon didn't dismiss it. He didn't call it fatigue, or error, or a misfiled tray. He looked at the instruments, then at Mara, and then he quietly said, "Finish the paperwork. Lock them in central, don't throw them out." Later, when Mara asked why, his voice was flat. "Because the OR doesn't give gifts. If something shows up, it belongs to somebody. And until you know who, you don't discard it." That night, Mara walked out of the hospital with her scrubs damp at the collar and her mind split in two. Part of her still felt the hum of adrenaline from saving a young man's life. The other part felt the sting of being chosen, singled out by something she hadn't invited. As she crossed the empty parking lot, she thought she heard the faint jingle of metal, like instruments knocking together in a tray carried just out of sight. She did not look back. The next hallway smelled of disinfectant and iron, and down it another surgical assistant would swear she heard laughter echoing from the scrub sinks. The third time it happened, Mara stopped pretending it was coincidence. It was 2 weeks later. A routine gallbladder removal scheduled late. An add-on case, nothing dramatic. She almost welcomed the simplicity, the steady rhythm of clips and cautery. The kind of case where you breathe easier, where you joke gently with the circulator about coffee cooling too fast. Normal. Predictable. Safe. Except nothing in her world felt safe anymore. Not after the extra Kelly. Not after the 3 instruments that shouldn't exist. She scrubbed, gloved, and draped her Mayo stand with ritual precision, repeating the mantra in her head. Count, confirm, control. She arranged each clamp in its rightful place, sutures curled and numbered, scissors honed to their expected sharpness. This time, she told herself, she would be vigilant. She would catch the mistake at the root. For half an hour, the case was uneventful. The surgeon murmured for instruments. Mara passed them without hesitation. Suction whined. Monitors ticked along. Sponges went in and came out. Everything matched. Everything was contained. And then, an impossible detail. She glanced at her tray mid-case and saw a scalpel handle laid crosswise atop her scissors. Not the one she'd opened. This one bore an engraving. Faint, but visible under the lights. E.H. Evelyn. Her breath hitched. For a moment, the noise of the room seemed to pull away, leaving her alone with the inscription. The surgeon's voice cut through. "Scissors!" Mara blinked, handed them over, and swallowed the sting of tears she hadn't expected. The count at closure went clean. No extras. No deficits. The circulator marked it down as a routine case. The patient was wheeled away, stable, snoring under the last traces of anesthesia. But Mara lingered, gloves off, staring at the tray. The scalpel handle with Evelyn's initials was gone, as if it had never been there. Only the standard handle remained, unmarked, innocuous. Later, in the locker room, she sat in silence, hands pressed against her forehead. She tried to convince herself it was stress, fatigue, the mind playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the sound. The faint clatter she'd heard, as if someone had set that engraved handle onto her tray with care, not malice. She told me once, in the hush of the staff lounge, that she no longer believes the OR is empty when the team leaves. She believes it keeps its own attendance. That some hands keep working long after their owners are gone. And that sometimes, when the work is unfinished, Those hands borrow yours." She never said Evelyn's name again, not out loud, but every time Mara sets her stand, she leaves a gap, one space where an instrument could slide in if it needed to, a silent seat left open at the table. And when she finishes her count, her voice never wavers. But if you listen closely, you'll notice she doesn't just count what's there, she also counts the space. Not because policy demands it, because memory does. Because some stories won't let go unless you give them room. The vent sighed, the lights trembled. The next hallway pressed close, and somewhere down it, another surgical assistant swore she saw a handprint bloom on a sterilized drape that no one had touched. The hospital has a way of folding one night into the next, but some stories arrive sharp at the edges, separate, undeniable. This is a new one, told to me by another surgical assistant whose shift carved itself into memory like a scar. Her name was Lila. She was older than Mara, steadier, the kind of assistant who'd been through thousands of cases and thought she'd seen every shade of chaos the ER could hand her. She worked at St. Ignatius Medical, a sprawling Catholic hospital where the crucifixes on the walls never quite balanced the blood on the floors. Lila's story began with a trauma call. A car accident. Middle-aged woman, chest crushed, abdomen distended. They rolled her straight from the ER into the OR. No time to prep the patient with ceremony. The trauma surgeon's eyes were already flat with calculation. Where is she bleeding? And how long do we have before she's gone? Lila scrubbed in fast, pulling instruments into line with a speed that looked like calm but felt like survival. She prepped the trays, knowing that in trauma, order is more than ritual. It's the thin rope you cling to when everything else breaks. But the room was wrong from the start. The air smelled too sharp, like bleach poured fresh and not rinsed. The monitors flickered in their own rhythm, out of sync with the woman's actual heart. Even the crucifix above the OR door seemed tilted, as if watching from a strange angle. They opened the chest. Blood welled like a tide. The suction screamed. The surgeon's voice was clipped, urgent. Clamp, retractor, more sponges. Lila delivered each tool with the precision of years, her hands quicker than her thoughts. Then came the first anomaly. She reached for a vascular clamp. Her fingers closed around one, cold, heavier than expected, and when she placed it into the surgeon's palm, he paused, just for a fraction of a second. "Where did this come from?" he muttered, too low for most to hear. It was an older design, phased out years ago. She hadn't set it out. She knew she hadn't. But there it was, biting into the artery with a hunger that seemed personal. The second anomaly arrived minutes later. As the team packed sponges into the wound, Lila kept her silent tally. 5 in. 6 out. 7 in. 7 out. Until one came back darker than the rest, soaked through in a pattern that didn't match arterial bleed, but something older. Darker, almost black. She froze. Showed the circulator. The nurse frowned, shook her head, logged it without a word. And still the woman on the table fought. Her vitals danced between collapse and recovery. It felt, Lila said, as though something else in the room was deciding for her, pulling strings none of them could see. At one point, the anesthesiologist whispered, "Her pressure's coming up," with a voice that sounded surprised, almost reverent. But when Lila looked at the monitor, she swore the rhythm wasn't the patient's heartbeat at all. It was slower, steadier, something not human. They closed her up, against all odds. The surgeon declared it a miracle she survived the table. The patient was wheeled to ICU, pale but breathing. Everyone congratulated the team, everyone but Lila. Because when she broke down her tray, she found the old vascular clamp again. Only this time, its hinge was stiff, with something that smelled not like blood, but like rust. She set it aside for decontamination, filed the paperwork like Mara had before her. But she didn't sleep that night. Because she knew the clamp hadn't just appeared. It had been waiting. And it had chosen her hands to move through. The next hallway, lights buzzed low, and somewhere down it, a surgical assistant swore she saw a shadow bend over a tray already set for surgery, though no patient had been called in. Lila said the ICU should have felt like relief. The woman had lived through the table. Her vitals, though fragile, were holding. The surgeon even allowed himself a small joke about guardian angels as he stripped off his cap. But when Lila stepped into the ICU to check on her patient an hour later, she felt the weight of the OR follow her in. The room was dark except for the monitors and the faint yellow glow of the hallway light. The woman lay still, intubated, chest rising in careful mechanical pulls. Lines hummed, pumps clicked, the whole symphony of intensive care. But something about the air pressed heavy. The crucifix above the doorway seemed to tilt even further, shadow bending its edges. Lila approached the bedside, checking the dressings, adjusting a line. That's when she noticed the clamp. Not on her tray, not in the red bin for decontamination. This one rested on the windowsill, gleaming faintly in the monitor's glow. The same old vascular clamp, with its stiff hinge and worn handle. No one had carried it here. No one should have broken sterile to leave it in a patient's recovery room. She froze, hand still hovering over the IV line. The monitor beeped, a long, slow rhythm that didn't match the ventilator's rise and fall. It was deeper, heavier, almost like a metronome marking time outside of human scale. The woman's eyelids fluttered. She was still sedated, shouldn't have stirred at all. Yet her lips moved faintly around the tube. Lila leaned closer, against her better judgment. She swore the patient whispered a name. Evelyn. The sound barely brushed the air, but it was enough. Lila stumbled back, heart thudding, eyes locked on the clamp. She wanted to call the nurse, the charge, anyone. But her throat stayed tight, like the air itself held her words down. A shadow moved across the glass of the ICU window. Just a slip of darkness, like someone passing on the other side. But when she turned, the hallway was empty. The monitor alarmed, pressure dropping suddenly. The team rushed in, respiratory ICU nurse, resident. They moved in practiced urgency, stabilizing what they could, flooding fluids, adjusting meds. In the chaos, the clamp on the windowsill vanished. The woman stabilized again, a dip, a brush with absence, then back to a fragile balance. The surgeon chalked it up to post-op instability. The team dispersed, sighing with relief. Only Lila lingered, staring at the sill. Later that night during a lull, she checked the decontam logs again. No entry for the vascular clamp. No record of its existence. And yet she could still feel the weight of it in her hand, the click of its hinge, the way it seemed to tighten the air around her whenever it appeared. She told me she didn't believe in curses. She didn't even believe in miracles. But after that night, she started to believe the OR has its own form of ownership, that certain instruments belong to stories, not to hospitals. And once you touch them, those stories know your name. The next hallway was lined with wheelchairs stacked too neatly, and in the reflection of one chrome handle, another assistant thought she saw someone bending to scrub in, though the sink ran dry. Lila never saw the woman again. 2 days later, the patient coded in the ICU during the early hours of dawn, long before visiting families stirred awake. The report said, sudden cardiac arrest, unresponsive to resuscitation. The chart closed like so many others. But the clamp didn't vanish with her. A week later, Lila was assigned to a scheduled orthopedic case. Simple hardware removal, no trauma, no bloodbath, the kind of work she'd done 1,000 times. She scrubbed in, arranged her stand, counted, and confirmed. Everything was in order. The surgeon was in good spirits, even humming under his mask as the drape went up. Then, midway through the procedure, he reached for a clamp that wasn't on the Mayo stand. His hand hovered, palm up, waiting. And without thinking, Lila placed one into it. Cold. Heavy. Older than the rest. The surgeon closed it without looking, and the sound of its click echoed too loud in the sterile room. When the case ended, she tried to return it to her tray. But the clamp was gone. No one saw her pass it back. No one logged it missing. The record was clean, like it had never been there at all. That night, she didn't go straight home. She walked to Central Sterile instead. a place most avoided after hours, because the room smelled of steam and iron. She opened the drawers where decommissioned instruments lived, waiting to be discarded or sold for scrap. She ran her fingers over cold handles, pitted metal, forgotten hinges. Nothing. But when she turned to leave, the door to the autoclave chamber stood ajar. Inside, bathed in the glow of its inspection light, lay the vascular clamp, hinge stiff, surface clean, waiting like a patient. She didn't touch it. She closed the door, left the room, and never spoke of it again. Lila finished her career at St. Ignatius quietly. She retired after 3 more years. No incidents on her record. No patient deaths she carried on her conscience. But she never scrubbed in again without checking her tray twice. Then once more, searching not for what was missing, but for what might appear. When she told me her story, her hands stayed folded in her lap, but her eyes flicked to the stainless counter behind me, as if expecting something to be waiting there. "The hospital," she said, voice low, "doesn't let go of everything you put down. Sometimes it keeps a piece, sometimes it gives it back. And when it does, you'd better remember whose hands held it before yours." She fell silent then, and in that silence I thought I heard the faint metallic tap of something settling into place. The next hallway smelled faintly of iodine, and a surgical assistant swore she heard the metallic ring of a clamp dropping, though the floor at her feet was bare. The hospital doesn't ration its shadows. It gives them freely, to anyone willing to stand long enough under its lights. This last story came from Janine, another surgical assistant. 10 years in, pragmatic, the kind of woman who laughed off ghost talk and kept her tray spotless as a point of pride. She never chased mysteries. She chased efficiency. Until one night, efficiency wasn't enough. It was a late emergency call, an aortic aneurysm tearing open inside a man who'd collapsed in his kitchen. The ER stabilized him only long enough to get him under the OR lamps. Everyone knew the odds. They didn't speak them out loud. Janine scrubbed in fast. Gloves snapping, eyes already mapping what she'd need. Clamps for cross-clamping the aorta, vascular sutures, packs of sponges. The surgeon was already barking for instruments before the drapes settled. Blood pressure crashed. Seconds mattered. She passed each tool with flawless precision, her mind calm even as the monitors screamed. The smell of cautery and blood thickened the air, metallic, electric. And then, in the middle of the chaos, she felt it. A draft against the back of her neck, not the steady hum of the vents. Something colder. Moving. She glanced up, just for a second. At the far end of the OR, beyond the sterile field, the observation window was fogged from the inside, as if someone were breathing against it. But no one was there. She looked back down. Instruments gleamed under the light, neatly aligned, except one. A pair of long Metzenbaum scissors, resting across her sutures. She hadn't placed them there. No one had called for them yet. Her hands hesitated, just long enough for the surgeon to snap, "Metz, now!" She passed them forward. He didn't question where they'd come from. He cut. He worked. He saved seconds. But as the scissors went into the field, Janine swore she saw condensation bloom across the observation glass again, like a slow exhale. And this time, faintly traced into the fog, were 3 letters. ICU. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The team was too deep into survival mode. They worked until the rupture was clamped, until the bleeding slowed, until the patient's pressure clawed its way back into measurable numbers. The case ended in silence. The good kind, where no one wants to jinx what shouldn't have been possible. The surgeon muttered, "Lucky man." The anesthesiologist whispered, "Not out of the woods yet." Janine kept her head down, breaking her tray, aligning her instruments, though her fingers shook against the steel. When she finally looked up, the glass was clear again. No fog, no letters, nothing to prove she hadn't imagined it. Except for one detail. The Metzenbaums she laid back on her tray bore a rusted nick in the handle, a scar she'd never seen before. And when she counted, she realized she had 2 pairs. The next hallway's tiles gleamed too bright, and down at another assistant swore she heard scissors clicking open and shut, though no one carried them. Janine didn't sleep after that night. She went home, scrubbed her hands raw, and sat in her kitchen until the sun came up, listening for the faint metallic click that she swore still echoed in her ears. The next evening, she was back under the lamps. Another emergency. A bowel obstruction turned perforation, not as bloody as the aneurysm, but messy in its own way. The kind of case where you rely on muscle memory, on repetition, on the comfort of knowing every instrument by weight and sound. She set her Mayo stand carefully, slower than usual, each clamp, each needle driver, each retractor in its rightful place. She counted aloud, her voice low and steady, because silence felt too dangerous now. The circulator nodded, logging the numbers. Everything matched. For the first hour, the case ran clean. The surgeon's hands moved with confidence. The anesthesiologist murmured vitals in a calm monotone. Janine passed each tool like an extension of herself. For a moment, she thought maybe the night before had been a hallucination, a byproduct of fatigue and adrenaline. Then she heard it again. Click, click. Soft, deliberate, unmistakable, the sound of scissors opening and closing just beyond her shoulder. She froze. The surgeon barked for suction. She handed it over automatically, but her eyes slid to the tray. There they were, 2 pairs of medicine bombs. One clean, shining under the lamp. The other, older, duller, marked with the same rusted nick. She didn't touch it. She kept her hand steady, her eyes forward, her breathing shallow. But the sound didn't stop. Click, click, as if someone stood just behind her, testing the hinge over and over. The circulator noticed her stiff posture. "You okay?" she whispered, not wanting to break sterile. Janine nodded once, too sharp, too quick. The case continued. The patient stabilized. The closure began. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded wrong. When the final count came, her heart slammed against her ribs. Sponges? Correct. Needles? Correct. Instruments? Wrong. "Too many," the circulator said quietly, pen hovering. The surgeon looked up. "What do you mean?" Janine laid out both pairs of scissors, side by side. Identical except for the nick. Identical except for the way the older pair seemed heavier, as if it carried something she couldn't name. The room fell silent. The anesthesiologist's hand hovered over the monitor, as though even the machines knew to listen. "Pull the extras," the surgeon said finally. His voice was flat, but his eyes flicked toward the glass observation window. When Janine turned, she saw it again. Not fog this time, not letters, just a shape. A human outline pressed faintly against the other side of the glass, standing perfectly still. Watching, she blinked, and it was gone. The count was logged, the extras sent to Central, the paperwork filed, the case concluded. But as Janine stripped her gloves, she realized the sound was still there. Click, click. Only this time, it wasn't in the room. It was in her head. The next hallway reeked faintly of antiseptic, and in its silence another assistant thought she heard breathing against the scrub sink mirror, though no one was near it. Janine told me she held out for weeks, waiting for the sound to fade, for the second pair of scissors to stop finding her tray. She worked through appendectomies, gallbladders, even a string of orthopedic hardware removals. The work was steady, her technique flawless. But no matter how ordinary the case, the click followed her, sometimes faint as a memory, sometimes sharp as if it came from the table itself. The breaking point came on a night that should have been easy. A hernia repair, elective, converted to emergent when the patient's bowel strangulated. Routine, if unpleasant. She set her Mayo stand with ritual precision, counted twice, even had the circulator double confirm. 1 pair of medicine bombs only. She would not let it happen again. For most of the case, it seemed to work. Instruments in order, counts exact, the surgeon calm, the patient stable. For a moment, Janine let herself believe it was over. Then, as closure began, the overhead lights flickered. Just once, but long enough to catch everyone's breath. And in that instant she heard it. Click. When the light steadied, There were 2 pairs of scissors on her tray. The second lay across the sutures, rust nick gleaming under fluorescence. She didn't hand them over, didn't speak, just finished the count with her voice steady, her hands shaking under the table. The circulator marked extra on the board with a line drawn harder than necessary. The surgeon said nothing. No one did. After the case, Janine didn't go to Central. She didn't log them herself. She stripped her gown, washed her hands, and walked out of the OR without looking back. She told me that was the night she realized the scissors weren't following her into the OR. They were following her out. She swore she heard the click in the stairwell, echoing up concrete. She swore she saw a glint of steel in the window reflection as she unlocked her car. And she swore that when she got home, set her bag down on the kitchen counter, and turned on the light, she heard one last click from the darkness of the room behind her. She never checked which room it came from. Janine stayed at St. Ignatius for another year, but she never scrubbed for vascular or abdominal cases again. Orthopedics only. Cases without clamps, without scissors. And even then, she set her stand with one space deliberately left empty. A gap she never explained to anyone. When she finally retired, she handed me her badge, laughed once, bitter, small, and said, "The hospital doesn't care if you believe in ghosts. But you'd better believe in memory. Instruments remember who used them. And sometimes, they remember louder than you want." She never worked another shift. But I've heard more than one assistant in that OR mention the sound of scissors clicking, faintly, when the lights flicker during closure. Some stories close clean. Others keep